Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, folks. Hope you're doing all right, and welcome to a Snyk Live session. We join you today to report that on December 10th, the world was greeted by the latest great cybersecurity threat. Ooh. The developer community around the globe is working tirelessly right now as we speak to secure their applications against it. It is being deemed Log4shell, and we are going to dive into the weeds of it. We're going to dive deeper into it so you can get your burning questions answered. And so I join you as one of your hosts, but your other host as well is Kyle Suero. Hey, Kyle, good to see you. And we're going to be asking questions of industry experts that we have that are wonderful and amazing. And thankfully, we're able to join us today to help us learn more about this. I'm going to be coming at this from a beginner's perspective. So hopefully that'll help lots of you folks that maybe are learning through this experience and this event that's going on. And then Kyle's going to be helping us ask some questions that are a little bit more into the weeds, and he's an expert as well. So let's bring on our guests without further ado. We have Alyssa and Chris. Hello to both of you. Thank you for joining us today. How are you?
Well, we've had better days.
Yeah, doing well, but yeah, we'll get through this.
Excellent. Well, thank you again for joining us. And yes, I can definitely understand there have been better days. So for folks that are new to this type of thing, should they be concerned about this? And I know the answer simply is yes, but like why should people that maybe are just developers in the world, they're hearing this, they're seeing this stuff come through their feed, why should they be concerned about something like this?
So yeah, obviously the answer is yes. But I often say I don't get into this whole idea of FUD and trying to use using fear to push security. This is one that scares me. And it scares me because, as many of us are aware, just the absolute, not only the prevalence of this package. I mean, I saw some stats, actually, it was from Snyk this morning. Something like 90% of Java applications are running with Log4j. And, so that in and of itself makes it very nerve wracking. But what's really scary on top of that is just the ease to which it's exploitable and the number of different attack vectors that exist. I mean, the early one was this LDAP attack vector where, it was Jindy, LDAP, pull down a malicious package, and now they've got remote code execution. But now we're seeing alternatives where maybe that doesn't even work, but they've branched in other variants where I can exfiltrate data from your system just by not including the closing brace on that Jindy string. So, yeah, I'll let Chris share his thoughts, but this one scares me a little bit.
Yeah, no, I agree with all that. That's, obviously the first and primary concern. The kind of the second concern I have is a little bit more on the fundamental side, because this is really, unfortunately, exploiting one of the greatest weaknesses we have in our industry. It's the fact that we don't patch, we don't have good asset inventory, we don't even know where this stuff is. So the first thing everyone has to do is figure out, where do I even have this? Do I even have this? What's affected? So that first 24 or 48 hours, some people thought maybe they weren't affected, and then they kind of maybe read, oh, well, my WAF's taking care of this, and they're not thinking about the bypasses. So there's this kind of awakening that this is really affecting probably most people, not most people, but a large amount of organizations, and they were slow to respond because they just didn't even know they had it, because it wasn't like a core function. It was like a dependency of another thing they had, like Spring Boot or whatever it is. And so those are the things that concern me, is that we lost time. We didn't just jump on this on Friday when it first, it started about 2 weeks ago, but Friday is kind of maybe when we first started all hearing about it in depth. And people just didn't jump on it because they didn't know. And that's the part that scares me, is that, where's our data governance? Why do we not know it's logging, and what it's logging and where it's logging to? Like, this is fundamental stuff that we keep failing on, and this one's going to really smack us.
Gotcha. Okay, so now that we're all kind of, I know we don't like to, Alyssa, you mentioned we don't like to put people in that feeling of fear about this type of stuff, but we caught people's attention, right? So they feel that they need to pay attention to this and understand it more. But there might be some folks that still don't know what it is. So what exactly is it? I know it's deemed Log4shell, but can you all explain, or briefly for some, it's a beginner, what is this issue that's going on right now?
Yeah. So Log4j makes use of or implements functionality for Jindy, which is just a simple way of looking up information from various sources. And so within Log4j, the way it works is it's leveraging these lookup values that can be passed to the library at runtime to go out and then look up information that it's going to leverage within its logging capabilities. So one of the common vectors is to go get information from LDAP. And this attack vector with Jindy was actually discovered years ago. So there was a 2016 presentation at Black Hat about this exact attack vector of using Jindy to go and retrieve information from a malicious server under the guise of it being this LDAP lookup. And so you can imagine when you have a library that says, I'm going to go to some site that was sent to me by, whomever, the library doesn't know, it's just getting this information in a string. And now it's going to pull back a package and run that within the JVM. Well, if I, as an attacker, can send them to my malicious site and send them my malicious package, I can basically do whatever I could do with the permissions of that JVM.
Yeah.
And so it kind of combines a few things because you've got this injection attack, which is very similar to like what we would see with SQL injection or that sort of thing, where I can send this string, the initial attack payload, and I can send it through any number of ways. It could be fields in the application. It can be user agents. That was a really popular one early on when we were seeing these attacks come through. All these places, because they're all things that ultimately would get logged or passed to Log4j to parse in some way. And so it encounters that lookup string and it just goes and does its thing.
Yeah, and the other part that people weren't necessarily thinking about right away is that this isn't just the internet facing pieces. If this can get passed to your back end very easily, so everyone's thinking like, oh well, this is on the back end, this isn't internet facing, whatever. No, if those messages are getting passed back to do the lookups, then that those backend databases are very much in play.
Yeah, I think to sort of echo what Chris and Alyssa said for the sort of last question that we were talking about, I think this has been a great exercise for folks to know how good their asset management game is, right? Like how quickly are you able to tell what you're using and where? And I think a lot of folks, that's what a lot of folks are reaching out to me on Friday. They're like, how do I even know like where it is? So I think that has been a huge pain point for people. I think the egress proxies, like people aren't, filtering their egress traffic. So people, are having a lot of questions about that. And I think people are definitely looking in the right places, but, it took an event like this for it to seriously get prioritized, it seems.
Yeah, the asset inventory part, again, which is an industry, most organizations are failing at it. When this came up for me in my org, that wasn't really the issue, but honestly, I was, and I'm not trying to just plug Snyk here. I went to there immediately because I know all the projects that are in there, and I can immediately see which dependencies are, and then the exploit and the upgrade path and everything. And so I immediately on Friday was working with my DevOps team on their mediation and everything then. We double checked and we did other things other than just Snyk, obviously, but that was the first thing I went to because it was just easier to find it all, to be honest. The other asset management tools, they have the applications, but they don't necessarily have all the dependencies that are kind of buried in with them.
Yeah, I mean, I'll put my 2 cents in there for SCA as well. It was wonderful Friday evening as we were really getting into the throes of trying to deal with this, to be able to just go and create a report that gave me that list of every place in my scanned code that I had a dependency on Log4j, and to be able to catalog that and say, all right, now I can look at this, I can prioritize these based on where they exist in the environment and their connections to other systems and all the other things. To be able to do that is something that honestly is a luxury. As a security person, I'm not used to having that, but to be in an organization now that has invested some time and effort in software composition analysis as part of our just normal CI/CD process, that made responding a lot faster. Are there still blind spots that we have to be aware of? Absolutely. We're still going to do all the other work to try to find make sure we've hit all of the apps that could potentially have this dependency. But to have that as a starting point was just huge.
Yeah, I can't remember a time where something like this came up and I felt like I had good answers in such a quick time. Normally this is one of those things where your heart's kind of beating a little bit and you're, okay, where do I even look? I got to look over here. I got to log into my cloud and do some EC2 stuff. And I got to go in this other thing. And then it's just not a fun process usually to kind of get a comprehensive list. So this was a nice thing for me, honestly, on Friday.
That's great to hear, and it's good to hear, especially somebody that's a little bit more beginner to this, to hear that things and tooling around in this space, in this industry, has evolved to help kinda alleviate some of the pressure and stress that when these things happen. And of course, we don't mind you plugging Snyk, right?
Yeah.
Plug away, folks.
What
Uh,
else to plug? I want to plug the community because I feel like on Friday I had so many detection options like within hours that I was able to throw stuff in all sorts of different EDRs and SIMs and whatnot and start doing some threat hunting to know where we are even hit 2 weeks ago. And so and then you hit the enter button and you wait for a second, you hold your breath and it comes back clean, you feel all right. But that's what you're really going to do though, because fixing the problem is great, but if they're already in, you've got bigger problems.
So for people who you think might have been affected, or for people who think that they might have been affected, and maybe they're going through now and they're patching, and they're not sure if servers were compromised before. So this was a question I actually got. So how would you recommend people like that? What sort of approach do you think they should take? If there's somebody who knows that they had vulnerable systems, they patched them, but they're not sure if anything was exploited. Maybe their egress story isn't that great. How would you advise that person to proceed?
Well, it kind of depends on what tools they have available. There's options for going right on the Linux box. Like I said, the community was putting stuff out right away. I don't remember the exact command, but you can run like 3 commands on Linux box to see in a certain var log folder if there was attempts or whatnot. It's not the end all be all, because if someone got on and owned the box and then cleaned things up and deleted and whatever, then it's a bigger problem. But it's a first step in kind of going around looking for that. There should be some other indicators if you've got good logging that someone's on a box, changing things pretty dramatically. But then if you have an EDR or a SIM, there's other IOCs that you can use again to see if people are attempting it. So it just really kind of depends on your tool set and what skill set you have within your team. Some shops are just Linux strong and are really good on the OS level, and they have to rely on those kind of queries, whereas other people are maybe stronger on the security side and they're really good at writing IOCs for SentinelOne, CrowdStrike, whatever it is, in EDR, and seeing from that recording of all the processes what was going on with those hosts. Now I'll be honest, I think a lot of these are cloud, and well, not all, but there's a fair amount of probably cloud environments that may not have any EDR on them because they're not persistent environments and people kind of tried the agent thing and it didn't work. So then you have to kind of work with like Google Cloud put out their own IOCs. You can run it through the audit log and check that. So it's you kind of got to, again, process trial and error, cover all your bases based on each tech.
Definitely agree there.
Definitely, the maturity of your security program is going to be right in your face during this one, because what tools you have available, what logs you have available, where you're ingesting those logs, and what do you have Splunk or something else that you can actually query that data with? I mean, these are all the things you'd love to do. So I mean, unfortunately, it is often the case. It's going to be that SMB market, the K-12s of the world, maybe even into healthcare a bit, where they don't necessarily have all the tooling that they're most at risk from this, because they won't necessarily have an easy way. And that's where I think, Chris mentioned kind of some of the endpoint stuff and looking at, okay, can we at least get some EDR tools and deployed here so if people are on these systems, we've got something that can detect their activities and start to see if they're happening. Because if you don't have good log control and good log management and those sorts of things, you're really, it is such a blind spot. There's not a good way to be able to go back and say, did someone send in this attack string? And when they sent it, did that server actually connect outbound and pull something down? And on top of it now, of course, you've got a lot of people are scanning for these and making these attempts just to try to figure out who's vulnerable and to, for legitimate purposes, like people are trying to do the good thing and try to see how pervasive is this and who can we help. But even those will, show up in your logs now. And so how do you know, okay, this was somebody firing it over to a canary flag versus this is something we really have to be concerned with because, it came from a, Ukraine IP address or something.
Definitely. I think the log management story, like y'all touched on, I think the log management story, the inventory, story, like I think, people are definitely going to be paying more attention to that, especially, egress proxies from what I'm hearing. That's where a lot of the folks who are trying to remediate all this is where they kind of fall flat. They can't see where their traffic's going. So they don't have a good story around that, or maybe it wasn't, the emphasis, or they don't know what sort of DNS, outbound lookups are happening in their environment. So, I definitely think y'all hit the nail on the head there. That's a great answer. And, to the person who asked me that question, I think that's the best answer we can give you. So
I got one more thing.
Oh, Chris, please.
Yeah, and so another thing where mature orgs probably have this, less mature orgs don't, but just the like external transfer, like bit rate on size of files coming out. Like if you've got any sensitive databases, you should have some sort of use case in there where if there's any sort of high bit transfer rate coming out, you should be getting alerted on that because that's your PII, if that's your whatever your financial data, whatever your crown jewels are, and that data doesn't go anywhere, and all of a sudden any amount of it's going somewhere, that should be a red flag right there. So again, most mature organizations have use cases like that. Some less mature probably don't even have a way of measuring it because they don't necessarily have like an egress firewall or a DMARC firewall that's even measuring that. But that's a key one. If you're going to hold sensitive data, you should be able to know when it's moving out. It's kind of, to me, a responsibility to the people, the people's data you're holding.
So to the comments that you were mentioning, Alyssa, about folks that are scanning for good to try and help folks out, I thought I saw somewhere, and I'm curious if you all were seeing any of this or maybe know of folks that might be doing this, where they were using the vulnerability to try and plug it up, right? Is that kind of what's happening in some places that you're noticing?
So I've seen that talked about. I've seen some GitHub repos that have code to do it. My prayer would be that we not do that.
Okay.
Not that I don't want to help these organizations, but this isn't like applying an OS patch to somebody's box, which is high risk enough. You go into somebody's environment and you change the version of this library that they're using, where that can threaten to have massive impact. I think of my organization in particular, if someone were to go in and cause something, even if it didn't break the application, if it just broke the logging portion of it, the very serious regulatory issues that I would now be facing. Now, sure, shame on me that I didn't get it fixed sooner, I guess. But at the end of the day, we're not talking about something where it's, this vulnerable. It's not like what the FBI did, right? A few, number of months back, where it's come to light that they were logging into systems that had a long-standing vulnerability that hadn't been patched, and they were patching it. This is brand new for everybody. We just this morning got a brand new release from the Apache Foundation, 2.16, which now is the gold standard non-vulnerable version. So yeah, unfortunately, you do have to give people some time to fix their own stuff, because trying to, it's a noble idea, but the reality of it is, please don't expose yourself to that liability, because you break someone in that way, they will come looking for you, and it ultimately is without authorization, and you're probably going to find yourself in some legal hot water over that.
Yeah, Alyssa's exactly correct here. If this was like a really old version that most people are on, and we were like, 10 iterations later and people hadn't upgraded, we could all kind of slap each other on the wrist. But this is like one version behind. And it's very normal for organizations to wait for the stable release, to all the different, things to get worked out on it, and not immediately upgrade to the latest version. That's not, it's not a bad thing, because things, like you said, get broken very easily. And in this case, you do have to do some other upgrades to make it work. So it's not just this easy thing. But you should have some sort of plan, for when this kind of thing happens. You should have some sort of like change management form, like ready to go for upgrading a dependency, knowing that these vulnerabilities are they're going to happen. not, we don't assume it's severe, but we know things are going to happen. So you should at least have a process. So when you do, realize you have to do it, you can kind of shove it to the front. You don't lose any time on it. The dependencies and everything being linked, you don't want to necessarily have that automated in a way where you break things. And like she mentioned, my organization too, financially, we can't lose logs or we're in big trouble.
Gotcha. Well, thank you both for that insight on that. Really quick, while we're at this little bit of a pause moment, I want to thank our viewers that are tuning in live and being here and watching, and remind you all that you can ask your questions in the chat. We'll do our best to get them onto the show and see if we can answer them as well. So keep those questions coming. With that in mind, there is one from Davis Peter. Thank you, Davis, for prompting us with that. And the question that Davis is asking is, how can folks trace a backdoor that might be related to this attack? How would they approach that?
So that's always fun.
Yeah, I think Chris had a pretty good point. Like if somebody's messing with the logs, right? Somebody's in there. So if your logs are gone and you don't know why on even one host, that's enough reason for an investigation. Somebody's probably doing something. They're exfiltrating something. They've done something on your box. But I think I'll pass this over to Alyssa. I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so this is where a couple things that we talked about already. Again, a first step would be you can try an EDR tool if you've got something at your disposal or something you can get your hands on quickly. Chances are pretty good that a true attacker trying to leverage this is not going to write a completely new exploit for this, and the payload that they ultimately deliver is probably going to be something a little more commodity that your EDR tool might identify. It also can help you identify some of that egress traffic. And so you can do this at that system level. You can also do it at a network level if you have the tools in place, watching for those reverse shells and things of that nature. Where can you if you find those in your environment, that's generally what you're going to be looking for with something like this is probably somebody who, if they've installed a backdoor, there's going to be some level, probably reverse shell that's phoning home, and finding that traffic being initiated from, say, a server in your production environment. I think for most of us, that's a pretty rare occurrence. And so being able to at least just watch for that and understand why is this server or this container or this function initiating this outward connection to the internet.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is your standard security stack stuff you should have in place regardless of the vulnerability. So regardless how it gets in there, if you have all of a sudden unassigned binaries, making network connections, and these are things that to me are kind of table stakes for kind of use cases. Any sort of persistence, registry modifications, all the typical lateral movement stuff, you're going to see all that because they're going to get on. They're trying to do something. They're not just trying to get on and do a shell and then leave. They're going to try and move around, poke. They're going to do whois. They're going to do network scans. They're going to do all the things that they normally do, whether it's ransomware or Log4shell or whatever. The method doesn't even matter. Once they're on, all the patterns and the kind of behavioral stuff they do is all the stuff that you should already, I say already, but we should be working towards having, behavioral identifiers compromised to pick up on those activities. Because even though, 0 days and stuff like this, they're very hard to detect ahead of time. Once someone's on a box, people's behaviors are pretty consistent. There's only so many things they can do. And if you're looking for that, you'll see someone on the box, especially if you have an environment where people aren't, like in my environment, people go in and do surgery on servers. We kill it, it rebuilds, it's all terraform. So if someone's on a box doing stuff, it's like red lights everywhere. It's like there's someone on a host actually doing something, red flags everywhere. And then, I got stuff like Lacework, where if all of a sudden that host is making network connections to new outside hosts, I can check on it. Now, we happen to be in the crypto business. We deal with nodes. Nodes are new IPs all the time, so I deal with a ton of false positives with that. But I do due diligence every single time. I check it out. Is it a node? Is it Tezos? Is it whatever blockchain? Or is it some random Ukrainian country that hasn't come up yet? But it is good having that kind of anomaly type detection where a new network connection to an unknown host comes up. Not everyone has that luxury, but I'm fortunate to have that.
Excellent. And thank you, Davis, for the question. Appreciate it. Keep those questions coming, folks, in the chat, and we'll try our best to get them on. So forgive me, I'm going to ask another beginner-friendly question here. I noticed the term or acronym being said a few times, EDR. So for folks that maybe are learning about this stuff for the first time, they might be like, what's this EDR all about? How do I get it? What do I do? So could Could you all enlighten me on what EDR is and how it helps in this situation?
Sure. First of all, thank you for slapping me in the face and reminding me that I'm speaking in those security terms that are not ubiquitous to the world. We all need that reminder once in a while. So EDR, endpoint detection response. These are also AKA next gen fire antivirus, or whatever. They're the CrowdStrikes, the Palos of the world, the software you're installing on your endpoints, whether they're servers, workstations, containers, that do that host-based security detection. And when you think about a package like CrowdStrike, for instance, and we're talking about package that can do a bazillion different things. It not only watches for threats like antivirus used to do, but now it's it can manage your system, and it can look at network traffic, and it can understand and watch for specific IOCs, different activity within the the host itself, things of that nature. So yeah, that's what we're talking about. There's a lot of options. We mentioned a couple. Sophos is another one. Carbon Black. There's a whole host of them, and I don't want to play favorites, so I'm trying to name off a few.
Yeah.
I'm not endorsing one over the other here. But yeah, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about EDR.
Yeah, I think a good way to kind of think about EDR, kind of in different from AV or EPP, whatever you want, EPP, endpoint protection, is like EDR is kind of like a recording of like, you can literally record like every process that's going on. And then you build rules based off of like, okay, if a document spawns, WMIC.exe or something like that, and then something else happens in the net connection, you can create these rules that are based on just like, single processes. And, while the AV is looking for the heuristics of malware and all these other things and looking at quarantine, this is more, it can have a reactive phase, but it's more like alerting on behavioral type things that, again, pick up the lateral movement, persistence, all the other parts of the attack chain that the AV itself, if it doesn't get on initial kind of malware drop, the leftover artifacts.
Thank you both for that. And that was not meant to be a slap.
No. I was serious. Sometimes we need that, because we as security people, we do that a lot. We tend to speak in terms and things that others don't understand, and it's always good to have that reminder that what we think is a well-known term may not be so well known.
Yeah, and the military report writer in me should know that you always have to introduce the acronym once before you use it.
Yeah. Well, thank you both for being willing to go into that level of detail on that for a beginner. So Kyle, do you have another question for folks just yet?
Yeah, I think I do actually. So, how did you find out about Log4shell? I don't mean in your systems particularly, but where did you hear about it?
Oh, this is going to be a silly answer. Do you see this, the
Twitter.
handle down there?
Yep.
Twitter's my friend.
Twitter.
Yeah, we were talking about this already. It showed up pretty heavily on Thursday last week already on Twitter, and then Friday suddenly we started seeing everybody was talking about it, and as Chris mentioned earlier, organizations started to spin up their response. But yeah, for me it was actually through Twitter. Number of people started tweeting about it Thursday, and why is this? What are they talking about? And you start reading into some of the articles that were already getting released at that point, and okay, this actually sounds pretty serious and scary. I think at the same time, organizationally, I know we were starting to get threat intel alerts at that point too. So, it's not. I don't want to suggest that like my organization's IR is dependent on Twitter. It really is not.
I would love to ask you the same question, Chris. Did you figure it out the same way?
Yep. No, Twitter was the first thing, followed shortly after by some vendor communications. But no, it was definitely Twitter 100%, because, I follow a lot of researchers and people in the industry that are, tinkering with this 24/7. And as soon as it, kind of hits one and they start sharing it, it spreads like wildfire. So you can knock social media what you want. There's a lot of really bad things about it. But one good thing for me is I constantly get to see, I would say, real-time threat intel to a degree that it's very rough and rudimentary when it first comes out, but it makes you start digging, and then you can start finding the real stuff through your other tools.
So this is actually a surprise two-part question. I'd love to ask if, if this were perhaps disclosed in a different fashion and maybe you knew about it a week before Thursday. Would you have handled it any differently?
No, my response would have been the same. I mean, I would have just gone through the same steps, working with DevOps, identifying everything affected, doing the threat hunting, getting prepped for possible IR. I mean, all this stuff was just kind of, pit crew type setup where once this happens, we just kind of, you just kind of go through the motions and, luckily everything's fine, but you don't just assume that. You kind of get ready for the worst case scenario, in my opinion. So if it happened before people talked about it a lot, I might have maybe felt less stress during that period. But knowing, if I had just read and really understood last week what it was, I would have probably been pretty concerned, even though it wasn't.
Yeah. No, and the one caveat I'll say I'm fortunate to have, and I think every organization is going to be different on this. I do have within the organization, there is a level between an emergency threat response and an incident, right? And in our case, we chose to treat this as an incident because there were active exploits growing at an exponential rate across the internet. And certainly we were already seeing them in our logs. From that perspective, no, we weren't compromised that we know of. We still haven't seen any indications that we've been compromised, but we wanted to, for us, there is one level above where, emergency patch, like, hey, this ODA just dropped and it's huge and we got to get it out right now. That's one response, but actually treating it as an incident is that way, that's like DEFCON 0, right? Like that's all the way to the top and beyond. But I think warranted in this case. Had it been more of a traditional disclosure, I agree with Chris 100%. I would have been equally as concerned about it. Maybe would have allowed us to dial that back a bit if we weren't seeing like active exploits in the wild at that point. Then it would have been like, all right, this is really bad. We need to get Log4j patched across all of our stuff. Most of the steps would have been the same. It's just the level of communication and that sort of thing and awareness, I think, across the organization changed for us because of the nature of this.
So I'll have one more question, then I'll pass it back to you, Brian, actually. So I think it feeds really well into this. So I'm curious as to, how big of a role your developers played in your response, or did it sort of, like, I know you're both sec pros, so did it all fall on your teams in security? Do you have some support from developers? Were developers ready to assist with this, or, was it mostly security engineering coming in and, handling the business?
From our side, it was absolutely all hands on deck. I mean, so that means our SREs, they were with us right from the start. The engineers, as soon as we could get them, engaged, they're involved because, we knew right away this was going to require code fixes in many cases. We're going to have to update some code somewhere. Certainly some of it was stuff the SREs could address. We had our security team involved, obviously. We had our SREs working with the security team to even just implement mitigations in the short term, firing up some WAF rules, making sure we had some of those detections that Chris was talking about earlier, get those deployed as well. But yeah, we did actually. We've had very good response. Our engineering community, at least within our org, has been phenomenal in being a part of this and just jumping on it right away and be willing to just deal with it. I think that's another case where I'm a little fortunate, and there's probably a few CISOs out there right now who hate me for saying this, but where we've got good processes that we've established in our DevSecOps for how we handle a P0 situation like this. And so thankfully we do have that in place. Is it perfect? No, of course not. I'm not going to suggest that. But it did allow us a mechanism to engage our engineers, our developers quickly, but also in a way that they are used to, right? Like this wasn't a new thing other than the timelines and the criticality of it, but it was, okay, we've had other situations, not even necessarily security related, where we had to deal with a P0 incident. And so having that sort of muscle memory was very valuable.
Yeah, I'm going to give most of the credit to my DevOps team. we collaborated early. I shared what information I had. We didn't have core Log4j, but it's a dependency for other things. So once we kind of clarified that, I would say the DevOps team really took the ball and ran with it on getting everything, loaded up for patching with the developers and everything. So in that regard, I did very little. But what I did do was the threat hunting and all the other things. So while we were exposed, make sure that nothing's happening, checking with our WAF, looking at, just logs, looking at suspicious behavior. I was very suspicious of like just anything that came in that was like I saw PII and the command line argument. I'm like, hey, wait a minute, who's doing this? And I had to track down the ticket and some other things like that. So, I did the normal security stuff, but it was very collaborative. And I would say the DevOps team did most of the heavy lifting. And obviously the developers that are doing the patching, a ton of work. I mean, all the work, to be honest. What I'm doing in comparison to that is very small.
I think that's as it should be, right? We are shifting left, right? There's so many security issues and so many vulnerabilities in packages. So I think we really do need to lay out, support our teams and enable them to do the work, but also, lean on them and, give them the autonomy to sort of, do the work, as they need to, especially when it comes to DevOps. DevOps is very particular, and I think it's, very much an emerging science. So yeah, these folks, they definitely, they wear that DevOps hat every day. They know what to do. They know how to respond to, supply chain and infra issues most of the time. So I think it's really great that, I think that's a really good, actually, story as far as, dealing with this goes.
Yeah, no, I have a really strong DevOps team that is security minded. It's probably not necessarily the standard everywhere, but I'm fortunate in that regard. So it makes my job a lot easier. And I also try not to be someone who cries wolf every time. I try and be reasonable when I'm trying to insert this and that. So when something does like this happens, I'm like, no, this is like kind of a big deal. But they're smart enough to know. They read they read what it is, and they know this isn't good. So I didn't have to do a lot of convincing that this needed, and of course the whole org got on board, all the way up to pretty high on, hey, this needs to be kind of fixed pretty quickly. So yeah, everyone got it once they kind of read the nuts and bolts of what was at stake.
Excellent. So this is a perfect segue into the question that I have as well. Speaking of developers, so Log4j, it's a Java library. I see some things as a developer on Twitter too, like some, there's always the poking of fun of other programming languages from people that are developing using other primary programming languages. But the reality here is it's a learning opportunity for all of us. And so I'm curious what you all think, like what can developers learn from this experience should take away to help, in the future prevent them from having some type of vulnerability like this in their systems and apps?
So, boy, that's the age-old question, isn't it? And I can't pretend to have like the magic sauce, but I think this is where the collaboration is what we really need. I've been talking about this for days with different people, anyone who will listen, quite honestly, but there's a lot of research going on right now into open source software from a security perspective. And Log4j in particular, because it's a very popular package. There's academia is doing a ton of vulnerability research. We see organizations like Snyk and others who are doing tons of vulnerability research, but it's still siloed, right? So we've got devs who release this stuff, and we have security engineers who kind of pick up on it and they start looking at it and trying to figure it out. I think, boy, and so I don't even know that it's necessarily the devs alone. Devs, what you can do is start inviting security people to be a part of your projects. And security people look for projects to be a part of. How many truly like InfoSec folks are out there who can say, yeah, I'm a security focused maintainer on this project? Not a lot. There are some, I know some of them, but really, I've heard the rumor, I don't know how true this is, that Log4j is basically 2 developers.
Oh, wow.
And why don't we have some security people in there helping them understand their threat model, helping them understand that, yeah, if you're going to implement these Jindy lookups, look out, this is some scary stuff. That's where I think overall we just, I don't want to put that just on developers, because we need the security side of that to be willing to. But since you asked what can devs do, I think that's the biggest thing is reach out, be a part of the community. If I look at my followers and who I follow on Twitter, it's not just security people, it's developers too, because we all need that DevSecOps message, right? We want to be working together on this and creating that culture where we do work together.
Yeah, it's a hard one when you're dealing with open source projects that are maintained by a couple people. But once orgs start adopting this, I think we need to look at what are we doing to test like what the system can what do you put an API endpoint open to the internet and not test like what results come out? It's one of those things where we just got to start thinking about, and I'm not going to say developers need to think about it, but security people need to be in the conversation to help developers think about it. What's open that doesn't need to be open? Like what kind of responses can you get that don't need to be there unless it's explicitly set to allow? And it's just, I don't want to use the term zero trust because I don't think it's the right term in this example, but one of those things where by default there shouldn't be things that just automatically dish out dump information or accept something without some sort of explicit acceptance or criteria. So whether it's this sort of thing for logging, whether it's an API endpoint, whatever application it is, there should be some semblance of some criteria under which someone can call something and make something happen or get some information back. And it's just kind of a fundamental thing that makes it more complicated and makes it harder, but those are things we should be testing for to help them. So what's odd for me for this one is that it's such a simple exploit that it's just, and it was brought up years ago. I just don't understand how just no one saw it earlier, or just I don't know. It just, that escapes me because it seems so simple.
Yeah. So being that it was brought up years ago, what led to it coming back up, I guess, now? Do we know?
Everyone assumed it was fixed, a different version. I think the other thing too is that there's also different people saying what actually works and what doesn't. Like remote code execution doesn't actually work. You can dump data, but then you have to kind of do some of the workarounds. So some people probably tinkered with it at the time, and maybe for some other reasons it wasn't working. So they thought, oh well, there's nothing there now, but it was just there the whole time. And what makes me curious is how do we test for that without like once you can test for it, but we didn't even know. So what could we have done to pick up on the fact that it would have you could have just passed this message and either ran some code or got some sort of answer back.
Yeah.
No, and that's where I get back to, imagine if you had security folks, or even if you had developers who were interested in it, but let's just assume for a minute we've got devs who want to just be heads down software developing. Imagine doing a threat model on this at the point that they were writing version 2 where they were adding Jindy. Like if you had somebody, and I'm not talking about like put that idea of like these big threat models with DFD diagrams and all that crazy stuff, put that out of your head. I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about sit down, look at it for a few minutes, understand what it is that you're implementing, and have somebody in the room, be willing to have somebody in the room who can ask some of those hypothetical questions. What could we possibly be breaking here? What could we possibly be creating in terms of a security hole? The way I always put it, what could possibly go wrong if we're going to launch with this Jindy functionality? What's that going to mean for us? I look back to one of my favorites of all time is if you look at the OAuth 2, the original specification, they didn't just release an RFC. They actually released a completely separate threat model for it. And it talked about some of the common ways that you could implement it that would be vulnerable. So, consider if we did that from an open source perspective, how powerful that would be. But, open source maintainers are largely volunteers. They're largely devs. And, maybe they're not always the most security minded devs. So, that's where I think we can really start to improve is just how do we take what we're writing and we're throwing out to the world and say, all right, here's some things you could do with this that would be really bad.
Yeah, when you have a small project and they're just trying to get out into the world, they're going to do what works the easiest, the plug and play, what just automatically works out of the box so that there's a good user experience and then people like it and that it can maybe become something. So you can't really blame them for that. But once you implement it in an enterprise organization, I'm not saying you can throw a CIS benchmark model against it, but you should be doing a process like that. Like, hey, what's on? What can I turn off that we just don't even need? And that is on the enterprise. And unfortunately, we just, we do it at the OS level, we do it at all these other levels. But when it comes to like dependencies, how often are we going in and looking at those settings, line by line and going, okay, if we leave this on, what does this mean? If we set to true, what does this mean? If set to false? Because it's just so arduous, especially when there's a ton of dependencies. But we have to do something like that, whether it's manual, automated, or what. We do it once, then you can make a clone and automate all you want. But you should at least go through it once, so you're not just again leaving stuff open that doesn't even need to be there. Especially if you're not even using the functionality, it's just an exploit open.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you as a developer, like with experience in this and firsthand, you don't, unless you're actively looking for, use a new open source library, unless you're actively looking for the security features that are available to it, and maybe it's not turned on by default, you have to turn it on through those options, right? You're just looking at the end of the day, you're getting graded on in your performance review on what features you're delivering and value you're delivering, and if security is not looped into that whole loop, that whole process, then you're not necessarily going to be having that at the top of mind all the time too. So I realize, yeah, it's a little bit of a loaded question, but it's definitely something I'm very passionate about. And I think that we, as a developer that's interested in this space, having more education around these types of topics and this thing. And I look at this as much as it being a scary event that's going on right now, and a lot of people are, sweating, doing their due diligence to resolve things. I see it as going to be a pretty long-term learning example for us as developers to to prepare us for the future.
Yeah, I think it's one of those
Go ahead,
things
Chris.
where if a security team works with their developers or DevOps team, it just gets the mentality of like, if you don't need it, turn it off. If it doesn't need to be, like just go through all the settings that you have. And if you don't need it, turn it off. If there's a safer version, go to that. It's not like you need to give them a roadmap on every single one, but just that mentality, of, again, zero trust, if you would. But, it's just getting them thinking like that, because they're the ones that are looking at the different options and going, okay, well, none of this matters to me, it just needs to work. But just telling them like, hey, if this thing is set to true and you don't even know what it is, take a second or send it over to the security team, like, hey, can you guys do some research on what happens if I try and take as much off of their plate as possible, because they got a sprint, they got timelines to meet, they got to make the company money. We're not supposed to be a roadblock, we're supposed to be a way to get them to yes faster in a secure way. And so, if they need some help with that, maybe some of the security teams need to pick up some slack on, give them some standard, do some research on the applications and say, hey, you know what, this is the configurations on the stuff that you need to make on the, dependencies in order to, not leave stuff open.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I'm glad to hear that you all have that mentality of like not wanting to be a blocker for the developers. And if I may offer advice for any developers that are listening to this right now that are working in a development team and you have like a security team and those teams are kind of siloed, I strongly encourage you to try and find at least one of those people on the security team that is open and willing to, take you under their wing, so to speak, and point you in the right direction if you have some interest in this space and that kind of thing. That's what worked out for me, and I'm confident that it will work out for others as well. You just got to kind of push through to see if you can do that. In terms of a resource for developers too, shameless plug here a little bit. The Snyk team, the awesome folks at Snyk here, have been putting together a awesome Log4shell list of resources up on GitHub. So those developers that are maybe familiar with the awesome lists that are out there, it's an aggregation of awesome things around a certain topic or concept and that kind of thing. And so we have put out an awesome list. I'm going to plug here really quick. Is over on GitHub under the Snyk Labs organization. Awesome Log4shell. So check that out. And if we all, welcome contributions as well. If people find other, you know, resources that are super helpful to help people learn about this whole thing, please feel free to open up a PR there. All right. Cool. So, Kyle, what do you got up for us next? Anything queued up in the chat? And questions, please keep them coming up in the chat, folks. If you got any, we're here to.
I think we have a great question from Eric if you want to throw that up. Also, anyone who's still looking for, I haven't added this to our awesome list yet, but there's a Jindy injection like toolkit. It's called the Jindy exploit kit, and you can find it on GitHub. And they just added the Log4j exploit to it. So you can have a little bit of fun with that and figure out what's going on in your systems. In case you don't know if you're vulnerable, you can sort of enumerate your systems and go through it and use something like that. But Yeah, that is a tool that's up there, and yeah, two folks were maintaining this project, right? So that apparently is true. Just two folks. And the actual pull request that introduced Jindy was from some random person who'd never been a contributor before. They made a feature request, and then some folks made a pull request. They merged it in, and that's sort of how this happened.
Wow.
But yeah, I had a link to the PR, but I can't find it anymore.
It's really convenient.
Very, very. And Jindy exploit kit, or yeah, the Jindy exploit toolkit came out in like 2019, I think. And yeah, there was a Black Hat presentation, as Mike noted, in 2016, and you could find the slides for that Black Hat presentation. It doesn't mention Log4j, but they're using like object lookups and stuff like that. And there are a lot of Jindy attack vectors that, not only LDAP, but RMI, Cobra, and or Corba, and all that. So it is definitely, it seems like a fruitful endeavor to learn about right now, right? It is very relevant, and folks are making lots of tools to remediate it during runtime, bite buddies as they call them. So like unintrusive, sort of like we were talking about, somebody using the exploit to patch. There's one of those from the NCC group. And yeah, there's just lots of fun stuff out there that you can mess with right now to, either pull off a POC, or, maybe if you're doing bug bounties, or if you're trying to patch your own systems, all this stuff will be applicable and useful for you for getting more information and solving this issue.
Excellent. Thank you, Kyle.
Oh,
Yeah.
Brian,
ahead.
could you post a link to the exploit kit? Sorry, someone just asked in DM. Here, I'll shoot it over to you.
Okay, sounds good. And Chris, you had something?
I was gonna say, this is one of my favorite times when these kind of disasters happen, seeing everyone respond like in a collaborative, mostly helpful way. Obviously, some vendors are like, oh, if you bought my thing, you would be good. But I see a lot more of the, hey, here's a way to check this, here's a way to test this, here's a way to see that. And I like that. I think that's the good part of what we got going on, and we need more of that. And just circle the wagons and act like a team for once.
Mhm.
But it's things like this, I think, bring the community together a little bit better. And so hopefully we see more collaboration and more people kind of thinking purple team type stuff, so we can, not have as many of these.
Excellent. I agree. I'm glad to see that too. But it's interesting. It makes me a little bit sad to hear that you're saying that it takes an event like this sometimes to pull people together. So hopefully that'll change in the future.
Yeah.
But in any case, Kyle, here's the link that Kyle was talking about for folks that are interested. GitHub.com, Pimps Jindy exploit kit there. Check that out to learn more. All right. So my question, I had one last question for you all, maybe at least from me, and maybe if Kyle, you got another one too. Or are there any in the chat? Let me know about that. But
we have a really good question from Eric, actually.
Okay,
back
yeah,
at the
yeah.
beginning of the stream.
Eric Smalling, yes. Okay, here we go. Thank you for calling that out, Kyle. So how would you all advise
Oh,
folks?
sorry, two
Oh, not
up.
that one.
Yeah.
Two up.
It's kind of a three-parter, it looks like. But I think it's a pretty good question. I think we have the right folks here to answer it.
Tell Eric I'm not answering his questions. He's
Oh.
being too complex and high maintenance for me now. I
All
know,
right, is this what
I know Eric, so.
Okay, good. You hear that, Eric? Kyle, is this the one you were referring to? A friend of Eric's?
Yeah, so that is actually the first part. And, they're not prioritizing internal patching, right? Patching internal facing services that might be vulnerable due to this notion by the team that, perimeter firewalls are enough. So how would you advise them to underscore the importance of patching, even these internally facing systems, right? Because as we talked about, and we all know, it can still get passed to an internal system, and people bypass WAFs and firewalls all the time. There are tons and tons of repos dedicated just to, enumerating and bypassing firewalls. So how would you advise someone whose team might have a more traditional approach, saying, we got a firewall up, we're good?
Yeah, boy, I mean, there's a lot of ways, and they're all, unfortunately, a lot of like, trying to just justify some of the technical aspects of these exploits. But I think pointing to just the fact that, Apache had to release a fix, and then another fix because new findings were coming up, and that a lot of that happens at those other control layers. So, a bunch of vendors released WAF rules that you could deploy in your your web application firewalls, and those lasted about 30 seconds, and then they had to be updated, and then they had to be updated. So it's it's a lot of this usual stories. Unfortunately, I wish I had like a better answer, because I feel like those usual stories are the ones that they've heard a million times and they try to ignore. But I think it is pointing to the real examples that we're seeing where those firewalls and things are being actively bypassed, as part of this ongoing attack, and those examples are out there. I think really showing them that this was taken serious enough by the Apache Foundation that version 2.16 now has basically removed the lookup functionality altogether, and that it was that important to that degree that this is why we need this, and really helping them understand. Uh, I'm going to assume in most environments, you probably have systems that talk to each other. They probably talk through APIs. They probably talk through microservices. Everybody loves their microservices these days, and that's a big thing. So, who's talking to those APIs? What controls do we have? And just, again, the fact that when you're using Log4j to log stuff, most people are logging a lot of information. And so any part of that log, any field, anything that you're getting as input is a potentially exploitable field. This isn't like we're just looking for just that right combination of unvalidated text field in combination with just the right SQL statement or whatever. I mean, this is anything that Log4j is going to touch will kick off one of these lookups if that lookup is there.
Yeah, I mean, the traditional legacy stack, as you mentioned, you can bypass WAFs, firewalls, whatnot. But I also think there's a difference between setting up a firewall and having a couple rules and actually having like layer 7 microsegmentation with multiple, just like the full functionality of it. I'm not saying you're going to block everything and it's different, but it just makes it harder. And if you make it hard enough through all these like just different things you have, someone might just pivot to a new target because there's just, again, everyone's vulnerable. So it's like easy pickings right now. So if you have enough stuff to just make it complicated, they at least may put you on the back burner. Are you still susceptible to like the serious players? Yes. Are you still susceptible to like someone who's got a mature exploit set up ready to go? Yes. But at least you're keeping like 90% of the riffraff out, and you can focus on and maybe see this as opposed to it being obfuscated and all this other kind of noise you're hearing from scanning and probing and script keys and whatnot. But then, again, stuff like EDR. So maybe you can't detect or stop the actual exploit right away, but can you pick up on someone getting on a box and doing stuff they shouldn't be doing? That should be a table stake type of thing, especially for your like really important servers. You should see when people are interacting with a host that is, sensitive, So you should have all your other detections at least there, and then you have to have some decisions on how you stop them or get them off of it or whatnot. And again, these are your production servers, so you can't just quarantine them or cut them off from the internet without some sort of consequences. So you have to have a plan for that. But that's the plan you should be having all year round, not on Friday.
Absolutely. So we're rounding out at the end of the session for today, and I want to be conscious of both of your times because I know you're super busy right now. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us for this. It was super helpful for me. I learned a lot. I hope folks at home, you all learned a lot. But if people want to learn more, I know one of the places you both mentioned was on Twitter. How can they, reach out and get in and follow you on Twitter? The best place to reach you on Twitter there, Alyssa and Chris. Right there, Alyssa's got it right in the name.
That's my handle. Twitter is definitely the easiest way to get in touch.
Yeah, I definitely did not put mine on there. Mine's Cruister, but with 2 zeros, so I don't know.
All right, go ahead, take a moment, and you could change your name in here if you wanted to.
Oh, I can?
Yeah, that'll let people check that out. So there you go, folks. Chris will share his Twitter handle in a moment, and be sure to follow both of them to keep in tune on what's happening in the security space and learn more. But another place you can go to learn more as well is, of course, Snyk blog. So if you go to snyk.io/blog, there's lots of resources the team is feverishly working on and putting out over on that site so that you can learn more about Log4shell, among other things that are in the security space for us to learn. All right, so thank you again both so much as we wrap up here. I appreciate you joining us, and I wish you the best of luck as time goes on the rest of the week as you're dealing with this situation. And hope to talk to you again soon.
Sounds great.
All right. Oh, let's do that. Just really quick, some housekeeping things, folks, really quick. So thank you for joining us. But stay tuned for tomorrow. There's going to be another show. We're going to have more live streams throughout the week. For tomorrow's, there's a live session that's going to be run by another fellow sneaker, Vandana, who's going to be talking with Jim Manico, having a fireside chat about this whole thing. So be sure to tune into that. It starts at 7:30 p.m. UTC or 2:30 p.m. Eastern time. You do the time zone math because I'm terrible at it. And go check that out. So say hi to them, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you for joining us.